Hey everyone, welcome back to another entry in my Unreal Engine 4 tutorial series where I cover topics that I feel are necessary for all developers to know about when developing games in Unreal Engine 4, and also topics that I learn from my own personal job at work or in my own personal side projects that I learned through my live streams with my side project Hero. So in this tutorial, we're going to talk about EQS, or the Environment Query System. We're going to call it EQS going forward just because it's simpler. So what EQS is it's an AI system that allows you as a player, as a pawn, or an AI entity as an entity to query into the environment and query into the navigation mesh to see what points are valid, what points are nearby, and things of that nature. I'll link in the description some more documentation about EQS just so you can learn more about that and more definitions on what it is, because Unreal's documentation goes into it way better than I can possibly do. But with this tutorial, I'm going to talk about how to enable EQS on different versions of the engine. And then I'm going to give you a pretty simple example on how to use EQS and how to actually debug EQS using the gameplay debugger. So let's get started. So I have two different projects open here. I have my EQS project using Unreal Engine 4.25.4, and then I have a second one for Unreal Engine 4.26.2. So to start, because simply in Unreal Engine 4.26.2, I believe 4.26 by the base, but every iteration above 4.26 has the environment query system enabled by default as a plugin. So if you go into plugins and you search for environment, you're going to find Environment Query Editor, and it says it's experimental and to use it with your own caution and things like that. So by default, it is enabled. So you're able to right click in the content browser and go to artificial intelligence and find environment query. However, in older versions of Unreal Engine 4, so this one in 4.25.4, for example, by default, it's not enabled. So if you right click and go under artificial intelligence, you're only going to see behavior tree and blackboard. You're not going to see environment query. And I believe under plugins, it's not existent. We'll double check that now. Yeah, so if you look under environment, you're not going to find anything. So there's two different ways to go about doing this and how to enable it by default with your Unreal Engine project. The simplest way is to go into your environment preferences. So if you go under edit, editor preferences, and then look under environment, you're going to see environment query system with a checkbox. You can literally just check that and then you're all good. The more complicated way is if you go to your projects directory and under config, you can go to default engine, and I'm going to copy and paste this real quick, and I'll zoom in for you. You have to add this EnvironmentQueryEd header here, and then enable EnvironmentQueryEd equals true. So this basically does the exact same thing as the editor preferences does for your project. So I'm going to save that. I'm going to do it this way. And then I'm going to go ahead and reopen my project. And then when we right click in the content browser, it's going to be available, the environment query. So right click, artificial intelligence, environment query. Let's see if the editor preferences actually updated this, reflecting it as well. So it still says it's false, but we know it's true. We can always just enable it that way too. Both the same way, it depends on how complicated you want to be, but essentially it does the same thing. So that's with 4.25 and earlier. And just to reiterate, with 4.26.2 or just 4.26, it's enabled by default under your plugins here. You can always turn it off if you'd like to. So with that said, I'm going to continue working in 4.26.2 because it's the latest version, but there shouldn't be any significant differences in what I'm going to show you next between versions of the editor. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a simple query, a simple environment query that we're going to pass in through the player to get points around the player in the shape of a donut, and just pick a valid point that we can then select using EQS. So to start, we're going to just right click, go to artificial intelligence, and go to environment query. We'll call this EQS player test or something like that. Doesn't have to be anything unique. And then we can double click that to open up this EQS editor. And it kind of looks a lot like the behavior tree. And you can use EQS in behavior trees as well. Typically that is the intended use, but there's other ways you can run queries and actually do things with it. So we're not going to go in the whole behavior tree side of things. It's too complicated for this short of a tutorial. We're just going to do a simple press a button, run EQS, and then show you how to debug it using the gameplay debugger. So to start, we can go ahead and do a generator. We're going to generate points in a cone. We're going to generate points in a donut. But there are other options here. You can generate points in a circle, cone, donut, like I said, in a grid, pathing grid, things like that. You can look into the documentation that I will link in the description to learn more about what these are exactly do. We're going to just talk about the donut. So basically, we have a bunch of parameters here for the donut. So we have an inner radius, we have an outer radius. You can say how many number of rings you want, how many points per ring you want to do. You can do an arc direction if you so choose to. It can generate how the arc will look. The arc angle, you can use a spiral pattern if you want. You have projection data and tracing modes you can look at. You can do the navigation, for example, so you can project down onto the navigation mesh. The center you can change. You can make your own custom classes. By default, we're going to use the courier. I believe that's how you pronounce it, and a courier. And in this case, for our player, the player is going to be the courier. It's going to be the center of this donut. And just so we can change some parameters, we're going to set the inner radius to 500 and keep the outer radius at 1000. So next we can add tests, and tests allow you to kind of pinpoint which point will be your best selected option between the points that are generated. So you can go by distance, you can do by dot products, you can do by gameplay tags, overlapping, pathfinding, all this different stuff, and you can create custom classes for that as well. So the most simple one that we're going to do is distance. So what we can say is for distance, you can distance 2D, 3D, by Z, things like that. You can change the distance to queryr or to whatever you want to pass in, any custom classes. You can do a filter type by range, minimum, maximum. We're going to keep it at range. And what we can say is the minimum distance we want is going to be 600, and the maximum is going to be 1000. So what this means is when it generates the points, since our inner radius is 500 and the outer radius is 1000, it's not going to select the points that are exactly in that inner radius, that 500, because we want a minimum of 600. So it should throw those out and only return the ones that are valid in this case. So now that we have an EQS, we can go into the third-person character. And again, I forgot to mention this at the beginning, but this is a blueprint-only project using 4.26.2, and it's a third-person template. And the other project with 4.25 that I showed you, same exact thing, blueprint project, third-person template. So in our third-person character, we're going to bind using the E key, so that when we press the E key, we're going to run that EQS that we made. So we can right-click in the blueprint graph. We can scroll down to Input, and then Keyboard Events, and then we can just find E as an echo, or you can go into the project settings and add the custom binding there, the action binding, but we're not going to do that. It's not necessary for our case. So we have our E event, and now we can right click and do run EQS query. So we have this, and basically this is asking for a couple things. So first is the query template. So that's this EQS that we made earlier. So we can grab that, put that into our template. Now it's asking for the courier. And if you remember, the courier is what we're passing into this EQS to use as, for example, the center of this donut, as well as using as a test. So the distance from these points that it selects in the environment to that courier. So our courier is going to be the third-person character itself. So we can right-click, get a reference to self, and put that into courier. Now, there's a couple other stuff here. Wrapper class, we're not going to talk about. I don't know much information about that. I'm sure there's something out there. But there's a run mode where you can choose, okay, you can get the single best item that it selects. You can get the single best item from the best 5%. You can do 25%, or you can get all matching. So we're going to just get single best item. And with the return value, it does return an instance object that you can reference. And you can then use this assign on query finished event, and you can bind to this event and you can get data from it. So for example, you can use a switch on the status so you can see where the status is currently, if it's failing, if it's aborted, processing success, stuff like that. But you can also get the locations. So you can get query results as locations. So it returns a Boolean, so whether or not this return result locations array is empty. And so if it's false, you don't have to do anything. But if it's true, you can get those locations and print them out. So for our sake, I'm going to just do a for each loop and print out the locations, just so we can see them on screen. So that's going to be the end of our logic. So we're running our EQS, so we press E as an echo, we press E, we run the EQS, we get the single best item. So this array should return only one thing, but we'll see. And then we take this object, that query instance object, and we can bind from it onto this event for onQuery finished. So when it's finished, we can get those results and print them out. So we can compile, save, and then go back into our map. So if we jump in right now, nothing's going to happen. It's not going to work. And the reason why it's not going to work is because we need a navigation mesh. So we can go here under place actors, we can find navigation bounds volume, and we can throw one into the map. And on the side panel here in the details panel, we're going to update its dimensions. I'm going to do 5,000 by 5,000 by 2,000, just so it's big enough to encompass everything. And I'm going to make sure its location is at 0, 0, 0 in our world, just to make sure it's all uniform and good to go. And now if you press P, as in Peter, you should see the EQS show up. So it toggles the visibility of that EQS. So all these green points are valid navigation points for us. And you can also go under the build tab and be sure you can build paths. And it'll say navigation build complete. Press P again, and we're still good. So now we can play, and if we press E, we get one single point. So, and as you move, that point's going to change. You can't really see the print strings too well. I don't know if going full screen will help, but we're getting points. But what if you want to actually visualize this? That's where the gameplay debugger comes in. So if you hit the tilde key, or not the tilde key, excuse me, the apostrophe key, you can bring up the gameplay debugger. And you have options like nav mesh. If you press 0, you can see the nav mesh. You can toggle AI and behavior trees if you want. By default, this is our character. He doesn't have AI or behavior tree. And then you can run EQS. But we need to select our character, because if you look at the top right, debug actor is none. So you can eject, select your character, possess again, and now we can see our EQS. So if I press E again, you can see new points getting generated. And here's our winner, for example, based off distances. So it's pretty super useful to see how things are being selected and how choices are being made within the EQS system. And you can actually, run this through, like I said, behavior trees, and then with this gameplay debugger, you can select that AI that you're testing as your debug actor and check out what the EQS is doing. You can see all this information here. You can see selected item, number 18 invalid, failed test because of X, Y, and Z, things like that. So it's super useful. And I hope this tutorial was useful for you guys as well. And if you're interested in more, feel free to subscribe here on YouTube. I'd be much appreciative of that. You can also follow me on Twitch, at Devin Sherry on Twitch, where I have game development live streams where I'm building a game using Unreal Engine 4, C++, blueprints, obviously, the gameplay ability system. And you can learn a lot from that series, because I'm personally learning a lot from that series. Building a game from scratch and trying to build something pretty interesting and fun to play. So I appreciate you guys. Make sure to like the video, comment with any questions, concerns, or other suggestions for tutorials. Thanks again for watching, and see you in the next video.